Hello and welcome to Border Crossing, essential information and opportunities for international businesses with Chip Hoebeke. These podcasts are designed to help you get a better understanding of some of the most important current issues and problems that affect businesses. Chip will examine the key points, help you to see the advantages and disadvantages, and provide you with any help sheets and support that you need. And just so you know, Chip heads up both the consulting division and the turnaround and restructuring practice for the firm Raymond in the US. He has served as a court-appointed receiver, a chief restructuring officer, and as a fiduciary in international, federal and state proceedings in the US. He's also a board member for the National Association of Federal Equity Receivers, where he heads up the International Committee, and he's a fellow of Insol International. If you want to get in touch with Chip, he can be contacted via the Raymond's website or on LinkedIn. We hope you enjoy this podcast. In this podcast, Chip and I are talking to Martin Trott about the hot issues and news coming out of the Cayman Islands. Martin is a partner of Rawlinson and Hunter, and he specialises in corporate restructuring and insolvency. Chip, Martin, it's great to see you again and here to look at everything Cayman today. How are you both?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Becca. Good to be with you, and good morning from the Cayman Islands.
Oh, yeah, you had to add that in, didn't you? Chip.
Yeah, of course he did. Good morning to both of you. That's another opportunity to be envious of where he is and compared to the dreariness of here. Although we do have the leaves turning currently, so it's not quite as warm, but it is very pretty.
Right. So I don't want to hear any more about the Cayman Islands apart from the financial stuff. Thank you, Martin. So no more about the sunshine or whatever. So come on, what are the hot topics going on in Cayman now? Do you want to kick off, Martin?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the hot topics are the restructuring officer regime, which was introduced just over a year ago now in the Cayman Islands legislation. I can provide an update on what's going on there. Generally, cross-border insolvencies and where that's at, and the challenges between operating in different jurisdictions and seeking recognition, etc. Chinese real estate debt has been a significant provider of work for Cayman Islands attorneys and practitioners over here. And then the whole noise around digital assets, especially the exchanges, the cryptocurrency failures, etc. So those are the main four that we've seen in the past year.
So not much going on then.
Not much.
Really?
Yeah.
Not much at all. So come on, let's start with the first thing. So restructuring and the use of the restructuring officer regime that's been now going for a year. So tell us, how's it gone over the last year, and give us some examples of when it's been used.
Yeah, sure. So just a very brief recap, because I know there's been a lot of coverage on it. The restructuring officer regime was introduced into our Companies Act at the very end of August 2022. And the purpose of it was to provide a rescue restructuring mechanism in order to enable companies that were financially indebted, were struggling, were financially viable, but needed some form of restructuring to benefit from a process, a moratorium that's put in place to allow them to carry out that restructuring. And importantly, up to that point, we only really had the use of liquidation to effect that. But obviously, when you're looking to do a restructuring, the end goal is to rescue the company. It's not to put it into liquidation. So that commenced, just over a year ago. There hasn't been a huge amount of activity, which has been somewhat surprising. There have only been, to my knowledge, 2 petitions that have led to restructuring officer appointments. One was Rockley Photonics, the other was Restructuring. And there have been other petitions that have been lodged for restructuring officers, but they've either been withdrawn before the hearing, or they've been denied by the courts. And most of those denials of those orders have been because the restructuring plan that's required is either not developed enough. There's not enough meat on the bone to the restructuring plan, or alternatively, it's not viable. So the court has decided that, notwithstanding the petitioner's views, the actual restructuring isn't viable. So there's been some activity, but it hasn't been super busy on filings, which is what we thought we might see, but hasn't come to pass yet.
Is that what you expected, Chip, as well?
Yeah, so it's been, I think, really interesting. It's definitely added the additional arrow to the quiver. I think we've seen it considered. It's been tried and tested, as Martin said, a few times. It's been thought about and started or stopped or just not started. I think that like any new regime, as folks sort of roll it around and get a good taste for it, they'll figure out where it's most useful. And that, of course, is also going to be impacted by what happens globally. We're going to talk about a couple of the interesting things popping through here, but I think most of the leading prognosticators anticipate some sort of a real recession, global slowdown coming up soon, maybe yet this year, maybe early first quarter next year. And, when those things happen, there's always more opportunity for these sorts of solutions to be figured out. So I think as it gets better known, as it's been getting better known, and as the economy calls for it, I think it's going to be added in as intended as an additional arrow in the quiver.
And often it'll be used as part of a global restructuring of a group. So in the example of Rockley, which was a company that developed sensors in smartwatches, that was done in parallel with a US Chapter 11 filing. So there was a restructuring in the US via Chapter 11, and then there was a restructuring in Cayman via the restructuring officer. So I think that's where we'll see it predominantly be used going forward.
Moving on to sort of cross-border group insolvencies, do you want to talk to us about that and what's been going on in that area?
So, a lot of interesting actions. They're sort of also on Martin's list there, but a lot of it is around the conflict between, do we take a global approach? Do we take a discrete approach by jurisdiction? And I think, for a bit of time, that universal approach, certainly promulgated by the World Bank and Insol and some of the big bodies, has really been the soup du jour, if you will, the flavor folks have been leaning towards. What we're finding, though, recently is some pretty significant cases where it starts to matter which jurisdiction you're in based on how proceeds are going to be distributed. I think that's some of the hotter things that I'm seeing right now going on. There's been some interesting cases that Martin can touch on too, about how priorities figured out in different cases where there's fraud involved. And so again, all sort of touching on distribution type elements, and because folks are starting to think about the end of the case now, at the beginning of the case, you're also starting to see some more interesting fights over comey and jurisdiction and where do you want these things heard and all of this sort of thing. So that's sort of I think that the highlight that I'm starting to see is some real cracks in the concept of universalism because of the distributions at the end.
I certainly agree. Yeah, we're starting to see some disagreements on comey and some different courts taking different approaches to the comey tests, and touching on the point that Chip made on the distribution side of things. There's a couple of ongoing cases that are different but have similarities. One is called TCA Fund, and the other is direct lending, both of which have Cayman connections and US connections, but both have been dealt with in slightly different ways, both US receiverships and both Cayman liquidations. And the challenges in a US receivership, where the distribution is based on equitable principles, the distribution mechanism in Cayman is very much on a statutory strict priority basis, which the courts can't deviate. That throws up some interesting conflict of law points, and there are some cases going through our courts here in Cayman and in the US that are trying to sort of sort that out.
Right. I mean, let's move on to the Chinese real estate debt. So talk to me about that.
The first thing to say is the debt numbers are absolutely staggering. China Evergrande is a significant one of those. I mean, China Evergrande is possibly the largest Chinese real estate developer. It has a debt pile of $340 billion, which is quite eye-watering. That's currently going through a restructuring. Has been going on for some time. There are parallel schemes in that case in the Cayman Islands, in Hong Kong, and in the BVI, which is seeking to restructure $20 billion of New York law governed debt out of that total debt pile. And that is one where the US bankruptcy courts are being involved. There was a US Chapter 15 filing for recognition of the Hong Kong and the BVI schemes recently, which to my knowledge is still to be heard, but that one's out there. And then going back a bit further, you had Modern Land, another Chinese real estate developer and property investor. That was restructured via a Cayman scheme. There was also US Chapter 15 recognition of New York law governed debt and a helpful judgment from the New York courts on compromise of New York law governed debt using a Cayman Islands scheme of arrangement. And there are plenty others out there. I mean, we're seeing on the advisory side, we're seeing a lot of work on potential restructurings where there's Chinese debt in these structures where Cayman Islands is involved.
You know, I'm not sure we're going to see a precedent that covers everything. I think you're going to see some territorialism, Chinese investment, Chinese insolvencies. A lot of times end up with the Chinese government owning the business at the end of it.
Yeah.
You know, there's not a kind of a bailout regime. It's not exactly that, but lots of times the solution is for the party to take over the thing. And so when you start talking about these huge properties like this, if it's in China, well, that makes a lot of sense. You know, are they going to be able to take control over that kind of property in New York, and the US and other places? You know, perhaps legally, yes. Perhaps practically, you know, that's a political matter. You start seeing policy come into play with these sorts of things, and I don't know where you're going to end up. I think you're going to have some scraps. There's literally live debates. There's an appeals case going on in the TCA matter right now, and you know, we'll see where it all goes. There's enough money at stake that these are the sorts of things that could make its way in the U.S. to the Supreme Court.
So let's move on to sort of digital assets and the crypto issues. We've had AAX, FTX. I mean, where does it end? It just seems to keep going, doesn't it? Do you want to talk about that, Chip?
You know, one of the beauties and one of the problems with everything crypto is new, unregulated, starting to get regulated, inconsistently regulated. It creates tremendous opportunities for good and bad. Right. And so where it's been good, there's been a lot of good advantage to it. It's been a useful investment vehicle, something easily portable. Also a problem because it's an investment vehicle. It's easily portable. You know, you can have your crypto in a wallet and a flash drive that's encrypted. And whether something innocently happens to you or something, you know, you don't want to give up the encryption code, you know, you've got a lot of wealth tied up in these different things. So to start with, no surprise that there's some growing pains with crypto. Then you start working into, all right, you know, every time that there's something new, there are folks who take advantage of it, right? There's these, the Ponzi schemes, which simply can use crypto as another tool in their Ponzi portfolio. There are the legitimate funds that just go bad because when you have something with value as volatile as crypto, that can happen, especially if you have volatility causing values to be low when demands for cash redemptions pop up. And that's I think what has gotten most of these folks into trouble, where they've either had legitimate trouble or they've gotten caught because of their not so great actions, is because when they have needed to redeem investors, when they've had to pay back things, the cash just hasn't been there. And the spiel here always is that's a timing difference, right? That it's just unlucky that the day we needed the cash wasn't there. If we just had held on a little bit, it had come back, and, you know, all of these sorts of things. But it probably, what I think, is the start of the maturation of the crypto markets, both because these events are coming up, but now what was, I would say, unbridled enthusiasm for especially the younger generations to get into crypto, they're starting to see what it looks like to get wiped out.
I agree with Chip. I think this is the early stages of the development of cryptocurrencies. I think undoubtedly cryptocurrencies are here to stay. But when you have little or no regulation, it's not surprising that the majority of these failures are trading platforms rather than the cryptocurrencies themselves. They're exchanges that have gone bust. Obviously, there's plenty of coverage around the FTXs, Voyager, Celsius, Three Arrows Capital, etc., and significant aspects of either fraud or mismanagement in these cases. So that's not a surprise. It is hitting a lot of the offshore jurisdictions. on the basis that many of the service providers are based here, on the basis of the tax neutrality of offshore jurisdictions. But it's here to stay for sure, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more and more of it, and cryptocurrencies will continue to be used.
So overall, the issues we've talked about so far, they've all been about the Cayman Islands. Do you think these are issues that are affecting other parts of the world, or do you think they are very discrete to the Cayman Islands alone?
No, these are all global. These are entirely global issues based on where the economic climate is in major countries of the world. It's not surprising that this is happening everywhere. Real estate is under pressure all over the place, not just in China, in Europe and the UK. It's also an issue. There's a lot of credit funds out there that for years have been fine on the basis that the interest rates have been low, but now we're starting to see some of those come under a bit of pressure, and so the distressed debt investors are coming heavily back into the market. So all of these issues are global in nature.
And do you think people look at the Cayman Islands and to see things that are going on? How big do you think the Cayman Islands are seen as on the global stage, and these types of issues happening there?
It's interesting because the Cayman Islands get a bum rap a little bit, right? People remember Johnny Depp and the Pirates of the Caribbean. I think Martin's got a peg leg and a hat and a parrot.
What, you mean he doesn't?
Nah, not only on the weekends. Or they think about the movie The Firm, and they think about the way it's portrayed down there. You see, these allegations of these buildings holding thousands of shell companies and all that. And so that's, in a lot of ways, some of the public perception. The reality is Cayman's a very sophisticated jurisdiction. They've got great professionals. They got a great judiciary, a very well-developed companies law that's dealt with all of these sorts of things. And so, I think that the people who are in the know look at Cayman, they see the worldwide issues being played out there, and it's actually a pretty good jurisdiction for an awful lot of those issues, not the least of which having hearings in Cayman's never a bad thing. You hope a trial goes on a long time if you have to come on island. But they have the right people, and they have the specialists, and they don't have people who aren't specialists doing this stuff. That's one of the things you get into the big cities in the US or the UK, and you can have people who hop into these big insolvency cases who it's the first time ever, or not very often. You look at someone like Martin, for example, and I'll bet you've got hundreds of liquidation appointments.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear the outside view on the Cayman Islands. Obviously, I can espouse the virtues of the jurisdiction, but it is used by many different types of entities, holding companies, hedge funds, to be a tax neutral jurisdiction for financing of major operations. So where you want to attract investors from a number of different jurisdictions, where you want to attract a number of lenders from a number of different countries, the Cayman Islands and the offshore jurisdictions generally are attractive in that regard. And as Chip says, a stable law, good practitioners, understandable outcomes, investor certainty are all things that the jurisdiction provides. But because everything we do here has an international element to it, is cross-border. That's why you see the offshore jurisdictions coming into many of these failures, because the financing is here, or the investors are based. Investors invest through structures here. And that will, I'm sure, continue.
So what do you both think we're going to see in the year ahead for the Cayman Islands?
I do think it's going to get busy. I think that, unfortunately, there's just so many stresses in the global economy, whether it's the things going on with the UAW strike in the U.S., which could have global repercussions, right? If they get what they want, there could be a lot more offshoring. You could have a lot of things mothballed. If they don't get what they want, it could bring things back into the U.S. You see the issues in the Ukraine and in Israel, and not sure how those things are going to fall out. The challenges China's got. We haven't talked much about the Belt and Road Initiative, but a lot of those investments are coming due, and some of those are tied up in what we have spoken about. But I just think there's a reckoning to be coming, and I think it's coming in 2024. You see the real estate market bubble looking a lot like 2007 and 8. All of these things point towards some activity. And, there's one of the things we don't talk about very much is, there was a point at which I think I saw something like I think Cayman was the 10th largest country in terms of the amount of money that flowed through it in the world. This might have gone back 7 or 8 years. I'm not sure where the ranking is now, but we forget it's not London, but 10th is pretty big. That's an awful lot of activity. And if you just have a small amount of that's troubled and needs restructuring, that's a huge, huge wave hitting the beaches of Cayman.
I think the interest rates is a major factor in the volume of restructuring insolvency work, and interest rates were at record low levels for a decade or more, and now no longer at those levels, and are consistently a lot higher. And so corporates and groups will come under pressure on their debt structures to service that debt via these interest repayments. So I think that the interest rates, if they continue to stay where they are for the foreseeable future, which it appears that they will do, are gonna bite, and we'll see more activity as a result.
Well, that's great to see you both. And thank you very much for your time today. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best place, or the website?
Yeah, both. So Martin Trott, I'm on LinkedIn, and rnhrestructuring.com is our website.
They can get me on LinkedIn as well at Chip Hoebeke, or at chip.hoebeke@raymond.com, REHMANN.com is the website.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much, guys, and have a really great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chip.
Thank you for joining Chip for this podcast. If you want to get in touch with Chip or any of his guests, please contact him through the Raymond website, www.raymond.com, or on LinkedIn. All views expressed in this podcast are individual opinions and do not constitute professional advice. Thank you.